Thank you for helping us stay on time. Everybody should be getting a star. Don't do anything with it. At this point, you'll be given specific directions. Please make sure you get a star. There's stars, different color stars going around. You will need a pen and pencil. Please make sure you get it. Anybody not have a star? Okay, we need a star in the front here. Linda, right here. Please make sure you got a star. Raise your hand if you need a star so my lovely assistant Vannas will know where to take it. Yes, we're going to do it at the end of her exercise presentation. Whip it, yell at you. Elizabeth. Please raise your hand if you need a star, and then we have a message from our sponsor. A lovely message from our sponsor. Okay, last time, raise your hand if you need a star. Okay. Okay, everybody please take your seats. Use your inside voice. And like I said, we have a message from our sponsor.
Hello. I'm glad so much to be invited and to be one of the sponsors. Hopefully, everybody enjoyed their lunch. I'm going to give you some real quick instructions about the paperwork. The first item is the statement of attendance for all those who are seeking continuing education credits or even a certificate of attendance. Make sure that you fill this out in the back properly and to turn it in at the end of the conference. If you turn it in now, I will not accept it. I will accept it at the end of the conference when you have stayed all day. Don't fill it out now and then leave. And be sure to write clearly your signature and to print your name clearly also. And this is a demographic form that we use to gather certain bits of information that helps us obtain grants, which we can use to help fund and to supply continuing education credits and conferences such as this for a low cost and for those who can attend in future conferences. So if you can fill this out for me, this is completely voluntary, so you can enter as much information as you want, and also turn this in at the end of the conference. And if you have any questions regarding continuing education credits, go ahead and find me. I'll be out and around. And thank you very much.
Remember the typical, in your worlds, victim who is heterosexual, white, etc. So what are the things that we can do? I think we've talked a little bit about the importance of training. So training is a big piece, but training alone is not going to change cultures. We're talking about changes within organizational cultures and in the way that we provide services. So training is a big piece. It needs to be institutionalized. I think JJ was talking about the importance of doing training for volunteers, for staff, for entire boards. But also I think he talked about the composition of the staff. We have staff and volunteers. We have to make sure that we are intentionally diverse when we are recruiting members of our teams. Not tokenizing people, but that we're recruiting a diverse pool of staff and volunteers, that we're intentional about that. Our policies and procedures also are another way to institutionalizing these practices. When we have an opening, where do we advertise for the job? Are we only advertising to the same pool of people, or are we reaching out to a larger group? Do we offer benefits for same-sex couples in organizations, or are we only catering to the traditional heterosexual family? And if we don't have the means to cover partners, and that's the reality for many organizations, but do we at least offer the opportunity to somehow, even if the person has to pay, that the fact that they may have somebody that's of the same sex, in a same-sex relationship, can access, so maybe not the healthcare benefits directly, but at least access to healthcare for all partners, not just those in heterosexual relationships. I think these kind of things change the culture. I think JJ talked too about when we're interviewing people. Sometimes these things will come up if we are looking for that. Are we giving people scenarios and maybe putting a survivor who's transgender in the scenario? If the person feels uncomfortable, that's going to come up. And that's the time to say, you're not the right fit for this organization because we're about social justice. And the other piece that I think is really critical is community connections. I think we talk about outreach, but we also have to create, develop, foster these alliances, this partnership with other organizations. We can't be everything to everyone and know everything there is to know about all groups. That's not realistic. That's why statements such as, we serve everybody, they make me very nervous. They're not true. So I think, let's see how we can bridge these gaps. So if we are working in our communities doing anti-violence work, so we need to partner with somebody who's working with elders. If we want to learn more about the LGBT community, we need to know who is in our community, who are the organizations in San Antonio, in the state of Texas, in the country. Who can I go to for technical assistance, for support? It's okay to ask. It's much better to ask and say, I'm not really sure, than say, oh, we serve everybody. Remember that social justice, if that's your framework for doing this work, requires that you really commit to being accessible to everyone then, and that you take the steps necessary to meet those needs. You can't do this alone. I think that's what I have about the LGBT and how to...
Thank you. Thank you, Heidi. Okay, I'm going to take it from here, start singing. Actually, I'm not going to sing. I'm just kidding. But I'd like to kind of take a moment, and it's easier for me to see if I'm kind of sitting right here in front of the computer. And it's not because I'm getting older and my vision's impaired. It's just the computer is just so small. It's actually because I'm getting older and I can't see. But I wanted to talk and really spend some time when looking at the years of prejudice when working with an older population. I was talking earlier about the life course perspective, but so many other things to kind of take into account. And that's already that this population is already suffering and is experiencing ageism, just ageism by itself. Just the way that the United States, this particular society views the issue of aging, and we're a very youth-oriented society. Everything's about young. Everything's about being youthful. My niece the other day, who's in 7th grade, told her sister, who's 21, who had just turned 21, that was like really old. And that's pretty scary. But when we start to address this issue of ageism, and then on top of that, when we have a population of elder adults who are also part of the LGBT community and have had years of prejudice, of dark alleys, of secrecy, of hiding, of lies to families and friends, and all the protectors that they put in place to secure them at their jobs so that they wouldn't get fired. And this is a whole family's denial of the, not to say that all single family members are gay or lesbian, or I'm just saying that there's this whole denial that's been going on for so long. So they've been facing this prejudice. And for the abuser, for the LGBT victim who's experiencing domestic violence, the abuser can be even just threatening to out them, to out the older adult. That in itself, even for somebody who maybe is even no longer in the workforce, that in itself can be very frightening for the older adult. Abuser can tell the victims, well, the police aren't going to believe you anyway. So they're even facing kind of that risk from authorities as it may be. Now, keeping in mind that this older person is also just experiencing just the basic symptoms of being older and not wanting to leave their home and wanting to protect their environment and not wanting to kind of shake anything up because they fear that, because they have so many maybe medical problems or whatever the situation may be. But also the abuser can also have gained control of their finances, and so this person really doesn't even have any control of that whatsoever. And also, not being protected by marriage or the rights of those who are married. And let me just say something about that for a second. Obviously, we know about DOMA that's recently come out, the Defense of Marriage Act, and a lot of other things that have recently happened in this country. But also keep in mind that that is something that's occurred at a national level, but a lot of the rights that are going to be placed are really by state. And the truth is was that thunder? Somebody trying to tell me something. Okay, I take all that back. I guess and the other point is that, like I mentioned earlier, when we start looking at end-of-life care or just start to make those plans, I talk to my students about this a lot. I tell them, I teach a death and dying class. I've been teaching it for over 11 years at Incarnate Word. And I tell my students, I said, look, just because you're in your early 20s, late teens, mid-20s, does not mean at all that you're protected. I said, you know, if you're living with somebody right now and you get in a car accident tomorrow and you don't have any advance directives in place, but you've already decided exactly the way you want it to be for your end-of-life decisions, and do you realize that if you've not put anything in place, that whoever that person is you live with, that you want to be your surrogate or your power of attorney, medical power of attorney, or your decision maker, it will go to your family. Your parents will be the person they go to as next of kin. They won't even consider that person that you're living with. So now with all the videotaping that we can do on the iPod, on your iPhones, or whatever it is, I suggest that you videotape it and you make it very clear, whatever those particular wishes are. I had a friend, I said, that had died a couple of years ago, and basically they made her sit. She'd been with this woman for 42 years. When her partner died, they had nothing in place, unfortunately. I'm not even sure why, but they made her sit in the back of the funeral home as a guest. Because she had a home that she owned that they used as a second home, but the home that they lived in for most of their life, their primary home, the family went into that house and said, this is her house and everything in it was ours and nothing's yours. They locked it up, they changed the lock, they didn't let her go in there and get anything. So there's so many other things to consider, and you can almost begin to see why there's such isolation among this particular age group. And I think that we should, kind of keep those things in mind. And the other thing is, that old movie, if you build it, they will come, that old baseball movie. It's the whole thing. If you start letting people know what's out there, I'm going to tell you right now, people over the age of 65 that are gay or lesbian are not going to come running to your facility saying, hey man, I heard you have some stuff, maybe you'll help me out. It's not going to happen that way. It's just not. Let me tell you what experience I had. I cannot get through today without telling a story about my mother. Those of you who have heard me talk, well, let me tell you, a lot has happened with B since last time I talked to y'all. She's no longer living at home. She's not able to, alone. We had a family meeting, and by the next time we meet, I'm going to have that video for y'all because we videotaped it. So I told her, you need to decide, where you want to live. You get to pick, and let's have a meeting and talk about it. So she said, okay. So we met with my brother and my sister and myself and my sister-in-law. What would you like to do? I want to live with, guess who? Simba, the king, the brother. So she said, I want to live with him. So she's been living with my brother for a little bit over a month now. And actually, she's looking really well. She's doing very well. She was having like 462 blood sugar. She was like on the verge of death. And, we've found out a lot of things. She's been diagnosed with dual dementia, vascular and Alzheimer's disease, and has continued to rapidly deteriorate over the last 6 months. And I just had her for a week. And so whenever I have her, we schedule as many appointments as we can. And so I took her to the podiatrist, her favorite doctor to go to. I don't know why. So we were sitting in the doctor's office waiting, and I got to make sure I don't give you any hint of who this physician is. We were in the waiting room. And my mother was ready, and the nurse, my mother has to be taken to the back really quickly, because then she starts saying, why am I still here? Why am I waiting so long? What's wrong with y'all? She gets upset if people don't drop everything they're doing to wait on her. So the nurses are really good. They come and get her, and they just have her go sit back there, and she loves it, even though it's not even her turn. So I was sitting in the waiting room, and this older gentleman and his wife came in, and they have those new the new laptop-looking things at the doctor's office now. It's for the EMRs, electronic medical records. Have y'all done those yet? And you got to fill it, and they're not easy. And it's a little pin you use. It's like a little iPad. Well, this little old gentleman came in. Number one, Spanish was his primary language, and so was his wife. They spoke a little bit of English. So when they walked in, the woman just didn't even look at him. She's down on her desk like that, and she says, "Here, fill this out." So this is what this man starts to do. He goes, he's trying to figure out what to do with the pen. And there's 16 people in the waiting room. Of course, I took about 30 seconds and I said, I can't stand it anymore. Also knowing that my B was in the room, thinking that as soon as the doctor comes, they're going to call me. If I'm not there immediately, she's going to be upset that I'm not there to hear her talk about how horrible her life is to this doctor. So I sat down with them, and it took forever. And these people were giving me their social security cards. They don't even know who I am. They're giving me all their information so that I could put this in their record form. And they were telling me their medical diagnosis. They were telling me everything. Anyway, when we finished, I gave the pad back to the woman. I said, look, he doesn't speak any English. And she said, well, do you think you can stay here through his appointment? And I said, first of all, yes, I can. But second of all, it's not really I can't do that. I was just kind of flabbergasted by the whole thing. But she said, oh, we just need somebody here because we have so many people like that that come in. Well, it's times like that you wonder, the jail cell's not that small that I could live in when I take care of her. But anyway, this is an anti-violence situation, and we're not going to talk about it. Nonetheless, I was not happy with that. So I go in to see B, and she's like, what were you doing? I said, I was out there helping this gentleman, and I kind of told her, and she's like, well, I asked the nurse where you were, and she said you were helping somebody out there. I never get to see you, and you bring me to the doctor, and the first thing you do is you go help somebody else. So that wasn't very good. But anyway, I took his $10,000, and I said, that's all I charge for this event. And we went on. Don't listen, APS, don't listen. I have a new bank account. Anyway, I think that, whenever I think of these situations in domestic violence and older adults and what we need to do for them, I think about that couple. Now, I want to use them to remind myself of the vulnerability that is so rampant among this population and how they are depending on us to be their advocates. Now with my mother's dementia, the other day she paid for lunch, which she never wants to. But she said it was $10, and she gave me a $50 bill. And so, oh crap, Jane, I need your thing. I just got locked out. It's the police stuff. Anyway, I don't know what the code is. Anyway, so I think with her, anyway, she gave me the 50, I gave her back $40. She said, why'd you give me 40? She said, I just gave you a 10. I said, no, you gave me 50. No, I did not. I don't have any 50s. Yes, you do have 50s. I don't have 50s. Anyway, by the time she got back to my brother's, I had still $200 from her. My brother's like, how much money do you have left? I don't know, Yvonne took 200. So if they call, please, give me a chance to speak to y'all first, please. Please, I would be so embarrassed. I know I'm gonna get a call one day, I just know it. APS, Joanne's gonna call. Yvonne, I hate to tell you this, but we need to make a visit to your house. And I think about the vulnerability. I think about the vulnerability, but I also think about the LGBT community and the vulnerability that they've been sensing all of their life. The vulnerability of being caught. Now here's the reality. No matter what your personal values and opinion and religious beliefs and spiritual beliefs might be regarding this particular situation, and I respect them, and it's what you believe, but the reality is that going to make it all go away? Is it? Is hatred going to make it go away? Disgust? We know, and we've talked about this before, the abuse, and many of you have seen this, we show it all the time. It's created by NCAL, and when we look at the different types of abuse experienced by older adults in later life, and the increase in vulnerability you can see here, that whole, whenever there's people that feel vulnerable, that other people begin to see this is my opportunity to have the power and control that I particularly need. I mean, this is exactly what I need to, because now they're vulnerable and I can take advantage of them. I just love these pictures I found of my brother. He's not my brother. Just kidding. It was a joke. Trust me. Trust me, he doesn't fall in this category, unfortunately. This fear of isolation, fear of being alone, long history of being told that they will end up alone, not only an ageist view, but also an anti-gay sentiment. Ageism faced with own community. A community believes that you've got to be hot and young, and that's pretty much it. And especially a gay community, even that might be some generalized statement, and I apologize for that. But I don't think that many people would disagree with that. The importance of youth within that community, and more vulnerable to sweetheart scams, looking for partners, looking for, and having to find this online and not knowing who you're talking to, or just wherever the situation might arise. And the discrimination, financial challenges that they might face, what services are available to them. Let's talk about that for a second. Name a service to me right now in the San Antonio community that's specific to the older gay and LGBT community right now, that actually advertises it, shows it, not that you have an extra brochure with all your other brochures, but who is that community? Name it.
There's not one.
There's not one. The Pride Center hopefully is going to change some of that. The Pride Center that's just opening, getting ready to open up on Fredericksburg Road. Looking for that. Housing concerns, depression, lack of social support. Depression is rampant among this community anyway, kind of an underlying anxiety and depression that's gone along all of their life because of what they've experienced. Maybe for some, just even seeking employment. Then the internalized homophobia. They've been told all of their life that this is not normal, this is not normal, this is not okay. And so they've carried it with them. So here comes the anxiety, the depression, the guilt, the fear, the self-loathing. So how are you, all that I'm talking about, and then we're expecting these people just to come to our front doors and get assistance. And it's not that simple and not that easy. In this development of a secondary family that they've developed because their own family has, maybe most of their own family doesn't, they never bring their spouses or their partners home because their family says never bring that person home. And all that time that they've been together. And now they've gotten older and they have other issues. I had another friend about 4 years ago that was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She was already toward moderate to heavy stages when we were able to do some intervention with her. But here's what happened. When she was retired military, and once she was diagnosed, and her partner had died years before, of early age, so she was living alone. And you know, everybody around her was aging. They were in their 70s and 80s, her other friends, and they had all kind of separated or they had passed on. So here she was by herself. And it wasn't until a neighbor called and said, something's going on over there. She leaves her water hose on like all the time. The car's parked in the middle of the street. They have to go tell her, you left your car in the middle of the street, because that's where she would park, thinking she was in the driveway. So luckily there was these 4 or 5 people, all, you know, in their 40s and 50s, that had heard about her, and she was in need, and we went over there and we just kind of helped her get set up in a memory care center. She had no one. She had a brother who lived in Louisiana, who had never accepted her lifestyle, never had spoken to her in over 45 years. She had a sister that lived in Arizona, who had also had not spoken to her in over 45 years. Whole history of just being self-reliant. You have to depend on yourself. I'm the only one who's going to be able to take care of myself. Because of disrespect, rejection of family members, and this constant disrespect from family members, because no one has ever done anything to try to support them or try to acknowledge them or doesn't even want to acknowledge them. It's very disrespectful. This becomes a setup for self-neglect. How does that happen? This disrespect, you know, how does that self-neglect then begin to occur? It's kind of what Heidi's been saying, that all of a sudden you're ignored. You know, you have to take care of yourself. But if you've had other people telling you that you're worthless, and at some given point, then you are going to start believing that. And once you start believing that, that's when the self-neglect occurs. This whole fear of being outed. Oh my gosh, what if APS or people I call for help or home health or wherever I have start coming over the house and start to see my paintings and my books and my pictures? Here's just some things I listed that you can take a look at. Is it important for training? Just some things that have happened recently on supports and rights for this population. President Obama issued a memorandum of hospital visitation directing Health and Human Services to issue regulations to respect the rights of patients, regardless of their sexual orientation. However, that doesn't make them decision makers if the paperwork isn't in place. Medicare too, they now have this, it's in 2011, the spousal impoverishment protections can cover same-sex partners now. It's important to keep up what's going on with policy. As agents, you know, advocates, you have to keep up what's going on with policy so that you know that it exists out there. And the VA's care is now open to transgender veterans. We met a colleague of mine at the restaurant last night, and she mentioned she works at the VA, and she said they had a very strong, and we're trying to grow their transgender program. That was kind of very exciting news to hear about that. So I have one little video I'd like to show you. Here's my lovely assistant, Vanna. We'll close up here. Is it 2:15 or 2 I'm supposed to stop? Oh, am I running late? Oh no, I got 2 minutes. I don't know what time it is. I can't see. Okay, good, we're good. Some of you may have already seen it, but it's become my, I watch it at least once a week. Here you go. Pay close attention. Pay close attention. It's kind of fast.
These are roughly 28,835 jelly beans. I counted out 500 of them and used those to weigh the rest. In this pile, there's 1 jelly bean for each day that the average American will live. You might have more beans in your life, or maybe less, but on average, this is the time we have. Here's a single bean. It's your very first day. A special day, but kind of a rough day on everyone involved. Add 364 more and you have the first year of your life. Now, for a sense of scale, here are your first 15 years, 5,475 days, which brings us to the threshold of adulthood. And at that moment, this is the time that we have left. And this is, on average, what we will do with all that time. We will be asleep for a total of 8,477 days. If we're lucky, some of that time we'll be sleeping next to someone we love. We will be in the process of eating, drinking, or preparing food for 1,635 days. We'll be at work, hopefully doing something satisfying, for the equivalent of 3,202 of those days. 1,099 days will be spent commuting or traveling from one place to another, maybe a little bit more if you live in LA. On average, we will watch television in one form or another for a total of 2,676 days. Household activities like chores and tending to our pets and shopping will take another 1,576 days, and we will care for the needs and well-being of others, our friends and family, for 564 days. We'll spend 671 days bathing, grooming, and doing all other bathroom-related activities, and another 720 days will go to community activities like religious and civic duties, charities, and taking classes. After we remove all those beans, this is what remains. This is the time that we have left. Time for laughing, swimming, making art, going on hikes, text messages, reading, checking Facebook, playing softball, maybe even teaching yourself how to play the guitar. So what are you going to do with this time? How much of it do you think you've already used up? If you only had half of it, what would you do differently? What about half of that? How much time have you already spent worrying instead of doing something that you love? What if you just had one more day? What are you going to do today?
Take an early break. See y'all around 2:05. Wait just a minute.
I'm not sure if you've heard, but the Archdiocese of Finley in the first group over here with the silent auction. We'll close the bids at 2:15 when we come back.
Okay.
Take time. Nothing, they all started, the bids start at $2. It's not like,
Yeah, 2:15. It's going to be $2.
She gives the money back to us to help people with food and stuff with the conference food. So, thanks.
First of all, I do want to take a time to thank our sponsors. Caring Companions over here have given us all the snacks throughout the day, variety, healthy. Vitas and Hospice Care and Dignity San Antonio help provide the lunch. So we thank them for that. WellMed and the Village at Incarnate Word. Well, the Village at Incarnate Word gave Heidi a place to stay last night so she could taste a retirement community. I forgot to ask her, how was it? Where is Heidi? How was living in a retirement house? So we appreciate that, Jeanette, wherever she is. So the Family Violence Prevention Services also is a sponsor to help us manage, to have a speaker here with us and provide things for the day. And I think we already thanked the Family Justice Center for breakfast. And so to all those, we say thank you. We thank you all again. At the end, Dr. Finley should have all the auction stuff ready to go. So if you bid on something. you bid on something and you think you want it, stop by. If you want to buy something that didn't get bid on, she's going to put them all on half price sales. So half of 2 is 1. You can't beat it. All right. So with that, I thank all of you for coming. And I would like to introduce Adriane Meneses. Meneses? She'll have to tell you how to say it correctly. She's a native to San Antonio. She's been with St. Mary's School of Law for the past 3 years. Presently, she is a supervising attorney with the Immigration and Human Rights Clinic. And she's also a graduate of St. Mary's University School of Law. She has represented a diverse clientele over her years of experience, everything from deportation issues, cases to application for affirmative benefits, and everything in between. So we're very happy to have her with us. And on the panel, it will be Heidi back here, walking up. And also Robert Gardia, who is from Catholic Charities with their immigration services. So with that, we'll start.
Okay, is that good? Everybody can hear me? About right there? Yeah, okay. Okay, we'll do. Thanks, Jane, for that. I appreciate it. And again, my name is Adriane Meneses. I'm at St. Mary's Law School. Did everybody get these handouts that got passed around? This one? And this one right here? Yes? No? Okay. I don't know if maybe I didn't bring enough or if they're still making their way around. These talk about federal benefits that immigrants are eligible for. We're going to get to that in the presentation. Just to a little bit of a disclaimer, I'm an immigration attorney, so what I do is I apply for immigration benefits for individuals, not federal health and financial benefits, although obviously that's an issue wherever immigration is concerned, and applying for benefits that you're not eligible for can get you in a lot of trouble with immigration. If you look at that sheet, it kind of breaks people down into different types of status. We're going to talk about that in a second. And if you look at it, I'm sure you see a lot of not eligible. So that's not good news. So we're going to talk a little bit about all of these statuses and how to get into a status that you are eligible for. I brought these handouts in part because, like I said, I don't apply for things of this nature for my clients. I help them get into a status where they qualify for it. So if you ask me, can somebody qualify for Medicaid in these circumstances, I'm going to refer you to the sheet because that's not something I've got a great deal of expertise in. Like I said, my expertise is getting them into a status where they do qualify for benefits and also where they're protected from deportation. So we're going to start talking about all that. So, and everybody can hear me okay? Okay, if I'm talking too slow, too fast, too quiet, you need to jump up and scream at me. I work with law students. I'm used to getting screamed at all the time. So I want you to interrupt me if you can't hear, okay? All right. So getting started, I can't really talk about ways, I can't really talk about all of these details without first talking a little bit about immigration law. This is skimming, this book over here in front of Robert Gardia is about the size of the Immigration Nationality Act. So we're going to try to slim it down to about 30 slides. So I just want to say I am tremendously oversimplifying everything, okay? But in an extremely small nutshell, immigration revolves around different types of status, right? And this is sort of the 5 big buckets of status. That's going to be U.S. citizens. You can become a U.S. citizen by one of 4 ways: birth, acquisition, derivation, or naturalization. We'll talk a little bit about that. Legal permanent residents, or LPRs. Probably going to call them LPRs throughout this presentation. That's going to be people with a green card. Asylees and refugees. Non-immigrants, it's going to be individuals on tourist visas. And persons with no status, sometimes called undocumented or even illegal. Those are going to be people who have entered the United States without a visa at all, or are in the United States and their visa or their status has expired, okay? We're going to run through these real quickly. But first of all, why is this important? Well, the immigration status that you have is going to affect all of these different things that I've got listed here, okay? But for purposes of what we're talking about today, the big ones are your right to stay in the United States and protection from deportation, your ability to change to a better status, and your availability of public benefits, okay? So briefly, US citizens. Once you're a United States citizen, generally speaking, you'll be a citizen for life, unless you renounce it in some way, but that's actually pretty hard to do. You can become a US citizen by one of 4 different ways. Like I said, birth, acquisition, derivation, or naturalization. We're gonna come back to some of those just in a little bit, okay? Moving through to permanent residence. Permanent residents are gonna be called green card holders. Permanent residents are allowed to live in the United States permanently, but they can lose their status and they can be deported, okay? That's very important. There's a common misconception that if you're a green card holder, it's just as good as being a citizen, there's really no difference. Wow, that couldn't be any farther from the truth. And really bad things can happen to permanent residents. A lot of my clients in deportation proceedings are permanent residents, okay? You can get some, but not all, state and federal student aid and federal benefits. You can do all of these things listed here. Generally speaking, in Texas, these stats are from 2011, best I could find on somewhat short notice. But we have well over 1 million people in green card status or permanent residents living in Texas, and just shy of 1 million of those are eligible to naturalize. In the United States, about 13 million people are in permanent resident status right now. Kind of going down the rungs of the ladder to less good and less good, or statuses with fewer and fewer rights. We get into asylees and refugees. We're not going to talk too much about this. Most people don't stay in refugee or asylee status very long because generally speaking, you're eligible after you become an asylee or a refugee to become a permanent resident after 1 year. Although there are some people who get stuck in asylee status who are never able to become permanent residents, and that's going to really affect their availability of public benefits for those individuals. Non-immigrants, really not going to talk about this group. These are individuals who are in the United States on any visa that's not a green card. The only immigrant visa is a green card. Every other visa is a non-immigrant visa. That's going to be student visas, tourist visas, all these visas here, and probably quite a few more types beyond this. And then, of course, we're going to talk a whole lot about people with no status, undocumented individuals, of whom we've been trying to get an accurate count in San Antonio. I've heard numbers everything from 120,000 to 300,000 and it's an extremely difficult thing to estimate, but I think it's fair to say that the numbers are extremely high. Okay, so people with no status. It's going to include people that are both in the United States who entered without a visa of any kind at all, or who've overstayed their visa, or violated the terms of their visa so their visa is no longer valid. Sometimes we call this group of people undocumented or illegally present. That's a bit of a misnomer because a lot of these people have documents. They are documented in some fashion. Some of them aren't even technically illegally present. You can be illegally present and have documents. You can be undocumented but not be illegally present. This is a tremendously complicated section of the law. And I'm not here today to train y'all to be immigration attorneys, but just to be able to spot situations where you should go and find an immigration attorney who can help out an individual who needs to apply for some kind of status or needs to be protected in some way. People with no status have very few rights or opportunities to stay in the United States, can't work legally in the United States, and can't adjust to a different status in the United States in most cases. Just to give you some general numbers about how many people we're talking about, the United States as a whole, about 11.5 million, or 3.7% of the total population of the United States. In Texas, 6.7% of our total Texas population has no status. So that's a lot of people. Not really relevant to this conversation, but about 250,000 kids in Texas have no status. This is especially, those are big numbers, right? I think everybody here would agree those are really big numbers. It's an even bigger number when you think about the number of people that are affected by that, because 85% of the people in the US who have no status have US citizen family members. And when I say family members, I mean immediate family members. I mean a spouse, a parent, or a child who's a US citizen. 73% have a US citizen child, and 13% have a US citizen spouse. It's a whole lot more common than I think most people think. A lot of political rhetoric sort of seems to refer to people with no status as if they're in a completely isolated bubble, and it couldn't be farther from the truth. Let's see, some other stats there. So about 2 million Texas kids have an immigrant parent. It's difficult to say how many of those are an undocumented parent. These stats, like I said, are pretty hard to come by, but these numbers are pretty high. Okay, so you can see from the sheet that having no status is bad. We just talked about all of these things that you can't do if you're undocumented and you have no status. So how do you immigrate legally to the US and how do you get status? If you want to be here legally, if you want to fix the fact that you're here without status, and you want to qualify for benefits and you want to be safe from deportation and all that good stuff, how do you go about doing that? There are really only three kind of categories in which you can immigrate to the United States. And when I say immigrate, I'm talking about permanently immigrate. I'm not talking about coming as a non-immigrant, as a student, or as a tourist. I'm talking about having the right to live here permanently as a permanent resident or something on the path at least to permanent residency. And those three general categories are going to be family-based petitions, employment-based petitions, or as a self-petitioner because you're the victim of a crime, persecution, or some kind of mistreatment, either in the United States or in your home country, okay? We're not really going to talk about employment today. We're going to talk about family-based petitions and victims of crime, okay? Both in the United States and abroad. But I do need to talk about this before I get into our different ways in which people can apply for status. They're called inadmissibilities. These are giant frustrations in immigration attorneys' lives. Even if you have an avenue by which to immigrate, like you have someone who can petition for you in your family, or you've been the victim of some kind of a crime, or you have a method by which to apply for status, you still have to be admissible. In the immigration law, there are a whole host of reasons that are outlined where you are inadmissible, okay? And many of these can adhere to more than one person. You can be inadmissible on, I don't know, 8, 9, 10, 12, 15, 20 different grounds, actually. You can't have any inadmissibilities in order to immigrate unless you qualify for a waiver. And we'll get to that in a second. These are some of the more problematic grounds of inadmissibility. The very top one right there, previous illegal presence in the United States, being in the United States with no status. So that means that if you're in the US and you have no status, you're going to have a very hard time getting status. So that's going to be a giant roadblock for most people. Okay? Some inadmissibilities expire after a certain number of years, some never expire. Some don't start expiring until you leave the US for a whole bunch of years. Like I mentioned before, however many inadmissibilities you have, you need a waiver for all of them in order to apply for status. This is a super complicated, I'm not going to get into any further detail beyond this. This is a super complicated area of the law. Every waiver is different. Every waiver's got certain requirements and certain things that it waives and certain times when it waives it. Very, very complicated area of the law, okay? But just to give you an idea, with all these people here that are undocumented, all these people, a huge percentage of which have U.S. citizen family, and I get asked the question a whole lot, well, why don't they just apply for their papers? Well, frequently they can't, because these grounds of inadmissibility apply, and so even though they have a U.S. citizen family member who could petition for them, they don't have what they need to be able to get a waiver. There is no waiver, they don't qualify for something of that nature.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
The previous deportation, is that one of the inadmissibilities that never expires?
The question was whether a previous deportation is a ground of inadmissibility that never expires. That's a complicated question. It depends on whether you're applying for a visa from abroad, whether you're applying for status from inside the United States if you've returned following a previous deportation. That's going to get really messy. That never expires. Additionally, you are, depending on who it was that removed you and how, real complicated here, you're subject to reinstatement, so you may not even be able to get to a stage where you could apply for a benefit in any event. And I'm happy to talk about that more in a little bit if we have some time. But yeah, that's a big problem. Okay. I think we just covered this just a little while ago. So a lot of times, even if you have a method by which to immigrate, there's no waiver available, or there is a waiver available, but you don't have the necessary qualifying family member to qualify for that waiver. Or even if you have a family member, you have to show a tremendous level of hardship to that family member if your waiver is not granted. Maybe you're going to have a hard time reaching that. Or maybe you're just scared. Because if you file this waiver, you come out of it, here I am, here's my situation. You think I have enough hardship to approve this waiver, they're all discretionary. What if it's denied? Then what? So a lot of people don't have the waivers that they need to apply for status, or they're just scared to take that chance. And it's a very legitimate fear. So this has been a real downer so far. I'm sorry about that. So let's see if we can find some bright spots, okay? So All that bad stuff aside, there are methods by which people with no status can get status. Okay, we're going to talk about some of those. We're going to look at family-based petitions or adjustment of status, U visas, VAWA, registry, and people that are citizens and don't know it. This is South Texas. That happens a lot. A lot. I just bumped into one this past Saturday. How often do you run into citizens who went to quarter? Yeah, and I would say that that's probably, I think probably each of us in my office, it happens about that often as well. That's a lot of people, really, if you think about it. So we'll talk about how that happens here in a second. But first, we're going to talk about unlicensed practice of law. Like I said, I'm not training y'all to be immigration attorneys. I'm not training you to fill out forms. Don't fill out forms. Filling out forms for you is illegal. Don't do it, please. It's also extremely dangerous. In the United States, only someone who is a licensed attorney in the United States, meaning if you're an attorney in Mexico, that doesn't count, or if you're a BIA accredited rep, only then are you allowed to give legal advice. Filling out forms is legal advice. Legal advice is applying the law to a specific set of facts. Forms look simple and they're incredibly complicated. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of terms of art in these. I can't tell you how many people come to my office in deportation proceedings because somebody decided to help them out and they applied for something they weren't eligible for. It's still illegal even if you're doing it for free, okay? And actually the Attorney General in the last year or so has gotten very aggressive about prosecuting this, which is a really good thing. A lot of people get hurt through unlicensed practice of law. A lot of people also go to notarios in Mexico. A notario is a licensed attorney, well, actually a super attorney in a sense. Here, a notary is a notary public. But with those signs out front that say notario, people go in and have them file forms. I'm sure you see this all the time. And horrible, horrible things happen. Hopefully all that will happen is their application gets denied, but a lot of times they get put in deportation proceedings. Okay. We just talked about this a second ago. Immigration law is super complicated, okay? Look at the size of that book. We're just covering some of the topics in a brief sense so I can tell y'all some things to look out for. But this is a particularly complicated area of the law. Also, deportation has no statute of limitations. I have a client right now who's in his 80s. He's currently in deportation proceedings, and there's a very strong likelihood he will be deported. He's being deported for something that he did in 1969. There's no statute of limitations in immigration. They can catch you at any time. They can, just because you have renewed your green card successfully for 30 years without an issue, you traveled home to Mexico to visit your sister every Christmas for 30 years without an issue, it can happen at any time. There's no, it never expires, it never goes away, there's no statute of limitations. So anytime you do anything with immigration, applying for a benefit, even applying to renew your green card, you really need to look into the person's entire history to make sure that there's not something there that they're going to find. And that also counts for naturalization, which we'll talk about here in a second. I just had a client who wound up in deportation proceedings when he attempted to naturalize, and they found out there was a typo on his application in 1996. Doesn't matter. And now you're in deportation proceedings, which is a really scary place to be. So, just a quick warning there. You're always welcome, even if St. Mary's can't help you out with your case, with somebody's case, we're always happy to help you find an attorney who can. You can also call Catholic Charities. There are, and in Raíces, another nonprofit here in San Antonio, there are places that can help you find someone to help with these things. But please don't be out filing immigration forms without having an attorney or a BIA rep look over what you're doing. Okay, so let's talk about some happy stuff, because this has been no fun so far. Okay, family-based petitions or adjustment of status. This is going to be a good option for some parents and spouses of adult U.S. citizens or LPRs, permanent residents, okay? It's going to depend a lot on how the individual who's seeking that status got in the United States and how long they've been here. Please don't assume that just because somebody's visa expired 20 years ago, there's nothing that can be done, they should go back to Mexico. You should always talk to an attorney before you apply for something and before you leave the country. Very, very important. However, this is going to be a good solution for a lot of people that have adult U.S. citizen kids, okay? Let's see. Unfortunately, for this particular form of relief, there's no fee waiver available, and the U.S. citizen family needs to be able to financially support the immigrant. There's a metrics that the U.S. government uses that you have to use to prove your income and whatnot. And a lot of the inadmissibilities are going to apply, and it's going to have a hard time waiving them. However, You are able to acquire green card status, permanent residency status, and access to most federal benefits after 5 years in that status. I just wanted to call your attention to this because I get questions about this at least once a week or so. The availability of immigrant visas or green cards is a complicated thing. If there's a parent petitioning an adult child beneficiary, you're going to wind up waiting about 20 years. But if it's reversed and you have the adult child petitioning his or her parent, the visa is immediately available. You got to go through the process, but there's no waiting time. Okay. On the flip side of that coin, that waiver, if you have a parent who's petitioning the adult child, that parent's not a qualifying relationship for the waiver. However, an adult child with a parent beneficiary is a qualifying relationship. So these things are very complicated. This is why you need to always talk to an attorney. Okay. It's also possible for individuals who've been married to U.S. citizens but never did apply for permanent residency. It's possible to apply after the spouse dies. It is possible for widows and widowers to apply to the section of the law. It's fairly new. It's only been around, I believe, since 2009. Something like that, yeah. You do have to, however, within 2 years of the U.S. citizen's death. So that's something to keep in mind. And it's surprising how fast that time passes. Okay, so heartbreaking for me when somebody calls and says, my husband was a U.S. citizen and he died, and I say, how long ago did it happen? And they say, oh, about 2.5 years. And now it's gone, and now I can't do anything. So if you have a situation, that's a time to find an attorney right away. Also, it is possible in certain cases, if someone's filed a petition we mentioned before, if a sibling or if if a parent applies for a child, that petition can be pending for 20 years or so, depending on what country the individual is from. If the petitioner dies during that time, it used to be that petition died with them. That's no longer the case in certain circumstances. So in some cases, even though the petitioner dies, you can still revive that petition. So again, this is something you need to see an attorney right away, okay? Please don't assume that all is lost. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you, it's all is lost a lot of the time, but it's not always lost. So you do want to find an attorney and see if you have options, okay? U-visas, I think Roberto's going to talk a little bit more about U-visas in a minute. This is sort of the magic visa. Anytime I can get anybody with a U-visa, this is a really great solution because it waives almost all of those inadmissibilities we talked about, including being in the United States without status, and depending on exactly which entity it was that deported you, it can waive previous deportations, depending on how you got deported. This is a visa that's available for victims of crime. In certain cases, this can extend their family members as well. The crime does have to have taken place in the United States, and the victims have to have assisted law enforcement in some manner, okay? It doesn't mean that they had to have caught the individual and convicted him or her, but they do have to have assisted law enforcement, and law enforcement has to certify that assistance. There are a list of, I want to say, 32 or so different enumerated crimes that qualify for a U-visa. Those include domestic violence, assault, sexual assault, things of that nature. So if you have individuals who have been the victims of these crimes and have no status, this might be a good solution for them. Fee waivers are available. One second. Fee waivers are available for all of the fees associated with the U-visa, and so you can essentially apply for free. Do you have a question?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I said, with undocumented workers, do you ever run into a case where the undocumented worker is afraid to work with law enforcement for fear of being deported?
So, yeah, and actually this is exactly why Congress, the question was, undocumented workers, are they ever afraid to work with law enforcement for fear of being deported? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, undocumented people are frequently afraid to call the police when all kinds of terrible things happen, which is exactly why Congress created the U-visa in the first place, to encourage undocumented victims of crime to assist law enforcement to report crimes. Otherwise, you essentially have a portion of the population who can be victimized without fear of ever having to call the police. Yes.
I'm sorry. I think my question was, how does an undocumented worker approach the police and say, I'm trying to get a U visa, so here I am trying to help you solve this crime? I mean, that's kind of
So you can call the police and report a crime regardless of your status. In order to apply for a U visa, every different law enforcement agency or prosecuting agency has a somewhat different procedure. SAPD has a fantastic procedure. In fact, Jane, who introduced me, heads up that's who I contact whenever I need a certification for a U visa, and she lets me know whether or not it qualifies for certification or not. Different agencies. I work a lot with the Webb County, that's Laredo District Attorney's Office. They have a slightly different procedure. But yes, I mean, if you're asking, does the police department need to know that this individual is undocumented? Absolutely. There really aren't a lot of circumstances, I can see a few, but it's very unusual, when you'd be applying for a U visa and you weren't undocumented. You mentioned workers. This is frequently violent crimes. It can, in some cases, apply to people who have been victimized at work. If it rises to the level of something like peonage or something approximating things of that nature. In fact, the Department of Labor just hired someone whose sole to certify employment crimes when people have been held and not allowed to leave their jobs or things like that, not paid for 6 months, that sort of thing. However, I would say that the majority of these cases are going to be violent crimes, a lot of domestic violence, a lot of things of that nature. People in U visa status have 4 years of status, but after 3 years you can apply for permanent residency. There's also VAWA. It stands for the Violence Against Women Act. However, it's not limited to women. Men can qualify for VAWA as well. That's going to be spouses, including common law spouses, because we are in Texas where common law marriage is recognized. It's going to be the spouse, child, or parent of an abusive U.S. citizen or permanent resident who's been abused by that citizen or permanent resident. Okay. Unlike the U visa we talked about before, this doesn't require law enforcement certification. They don't have to have assisted law enforcement, although it helps. There are, however, time limits if that marriage has ended either by divorce or death. So again, we're back to you need to see an attorney right away. Don't wait on these things. If their relationship is based on marriage, you have to prove it was a good faith marriage, stuff of that nature. That's stuff that I'm going to have to worry about, not stuff that you're going to have to worry about. If you do see a situation where an individual has been abused by a U.S. citizen, spouse, parent, or child, and this can be an adult child. Part of the function of VAWA is to prevent elder abuse. If they're being abused or neglected by an adult child who's a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, then this would definitely be a time to seek out an attorney. There are additionally fee waivers available for this, and so you can file these applications free as well. This is also, I'm not getting into this because it's tremendously complicated, but there are options available in deportation proceedings as well under VAWA. Like I mentioned before, deportation's got no time limit. It is not uncommon. I've had clients, I have a client now, like I mentioned, in his 80s in deportation proceedings, had several clients in their 70s in deportation proceedings. I think the oldest client I can think of off the top of my head that a friend of mine had was 94 in deportation proceedings. People have been deported in comas. I have a quadriplegic client in deportation proceedings. This is not an area that being old, being sick doesn't protect you from going into deportation proceedings, but there are options available. Okay, this doesn't happen too terribly often, but it does happen from time to time. Registry. If you've been in the United States undocumented since January 1st, 1972, and you've never left, you are eligible to apply for permanent residency based under registry. I do have a case right now with this. It's a real pain in the rear end to prove, but it's possible. Most criminal issues are going to cause inadmissibility, but you do find people, especially here in Texas, who've just been living here for a very, very long time without status. And if you're able to prove it, then that's a good way to clean that up and to get these people status as they get into their older years. And we talked about before people who are citizens and don't know it. The citizenship laws in the United States are tremendously complicated. In some cases, even if you were born in a foreign country and your parents were born in a foreign country, if your grandparents were born here, in certain circumstances that citizenship can be transmitted down to you. It's easier, of course, if your parents were born here. Obviously, if you were born here, you're almost always an automatic citizen. But you find a lot of people this is South Texas. We have a lot of migration back and forth across the border. This is something that the St. Mary's Clinic handles quite a bit of these acquired citizenship cases. They're difficult to prove, like I said, like a lot of stuff, but that's what keeps me in a job. But this is something else to think about when you find people that say, yeah, and it doesn't matter if the parents are dead, okay? We're not talking about if the parents are dead, if the grandparents are dead. If they were citizens while they were alive, And then in some cases that citizenship can transmit. So if you have people that are saying, well, I'm undocumented, but my grandparents were citizens, well, that's something that you need to find an attorney who can dig into a little bit deeper. Unfortunately, however, for a lot of people, there is no option at this time. People are talking a lot about comprehensive immigration reform. My fingers are crossed, but I'm not feeling too optimistic at this point. But obviously if that does pass, then some of these people, then some people that don't currently have any options are going to qualify. In the meantime, regardless of your legal status, you do have constitutional rights and rights to receive emergency care at a hospital. It's difficult to enforce, but if you're employed, even illegally, you have the same rights to minimum wage, overtime, and that sort of thing as well. Briefly, there is some assistance that's available to undocumented people, but as you can see, it's pretty limited. I'm going to real quickly. There we go. We're going to very, very quickly look at a couple of these federal benefits, but they're also in the sheet right in front of you. Medicare is going to be, Part A is going to be available to certain qualified immigrants. We've got qualified immigrants listed over here on the side. For the most part, that's going to be permanent residents, okay? If you have no status, then you're not going to be eligible for Medicare Part A. The buy-in Medicare, you're only going to be eligible if you're a qualified resident and you've been here for 5 years. So that's going to be a green card holder who's also been here for 5 years, okay? Meaning that if you just get that permanent residency, your adult U.S. citizen child petitions for you, you become a permanent resident, well, you're still not going to qualify for this portion of Medicare until you've been here for 5 years. And that's kind of a reoccurring theme. Emergency Medicaid, of course, is available to everybody, regardless of your legal status. I'm skipping through this pretty fast because you have all this information on these two sheets in front of you, okay? TANF, again, that's going to be available really to only qualified immigrants, primarily people with permanent residency who have also been here for 5 years, okay? Same thing with food stamps. If you're undocumented, if you have no status, you do not qualify for food stamps. That includes children. In order to get food stamps as an adult, you have to be a permanent resident and you have to have been here. You have to have been a permanent resident for 5 years. SSI. This is an earlier version of my presentation. SSI is not going to be available to individuals unless you've been a permanent resident for 5 years as well. Same thing with, for Section 8, it's available to permanent residents right away. We take off some of these other things here, abused immigrants. It is available in some other states, but not in Texas. Okay. So, that in a nutshell, the two groups that you're likely to be encountering are individuals with no status and green card holders. For the most part, if you have a U.S. citizen, then I really can't help you beyond that, unless it's a U.S. citizen who doesn't know he or she is a U.S. citizen. Non-immigrants or refugees and asylees, I doubt you're going to bump into that very often, but you probably will bump into permanent residents from time to time. And I do want to extend caution, like I said. We briefly mentioned that renewing your LPR card or your green card, that can be a potentially dangerous thing. That people call me up all the time. Well, can't you just fill out the form for me? Well, no, I need to investigate your complete background before I do that, because that's great, get into deportation proceedings. Same thing when you're applying for naturalization. A little bit about applying for naturalization, but I do want to mention that as long as you're careful and have somebody look into these things, you can apply to renew your green card and apply for naturalization for free. There are fee waivers that are available. Immigration's a little bit difficult about approving these fee waivers, but it is possible to get them, okay? So the way that most people who are not born in the United States become U.S. citizens is through naturalization. I mentioned acquisitions, I mentioned derivation, but for the most part it's going to be naturalization. And over 1 million people become naturalized citizens every year. That said, if you look at these numbers down here, about 1 out of 7 don't make it. And a lot of those wind up being put in deportation proceedings. So again, I do want to mention you should be very, very careful. That said, it's worth it to look into it and see if it's safe for people in green card status to apply to naturalize, because look at these benefits and all the stuff that you don't qualify if you're not a U.S. citizen. I know it also affects life insurance and things of that nature as well. To naturalize, generally speaking, you have to be 18 years old and be a permanent resident for at least 5 years. So A lot of these categories here say that you can't qualify for public benefits unless you've been a permanent resident for 5 years, and you can't qualify for naturalization unless you've been a permanent resident for 5 years. So there's not going to be a lot of ways to get around those 5 years. It's slightly shorter if you get your permanent residency through marriage to a U.S. citizen, then it's only 3 years. But I think for most people that we're talking about today, it's going to be the full 5. There are some requirements that you have to meet in order to naturalize. This is, again, oversimplification. You do have to be able to pass a test of U.S. history and government and be able to read, speak, and write English. However, there's some waivers for the English requirement. If you, the 50-20 rule, the 55-15 rule, those are ways to get around the English requirement. If you're over the age of 50 and you've been a permanent resident for 20 years, then you qualify for an exemption of the English. You still have to go through the entire naturalization interview and you take the civics test, but you can take it in your native language. Same thing with 55 and 15. There is a special consideration rule. If you're 65 or older and you've been a permanent resident for 20 years, you get to take an easier test. The test is 100 questions. The special consideration test, you pick from a shorter list of 20 questions. Some of the questions are a little tricky. I have to admit that I did not get 100% when I sat down and took it the other day. It's a little embarrassing. So it's definitely something to prepare for. And if you can qualify for the special consideration, then I would advise that people do that. And this is an earlier version of my presentation, it looks like. So I apologize for that. I did also want to mention that there are some exemptions as well for individuals who have severe physical disabilities and aren't able to travel to immigration to take to have the test. Immigration is required to make reasonable accommodations. If you're not able to travel, if you are deaf, if you are blind, if you have some kind of disability, they are able to make accommodations. They're able to go to you. You do have to request it. It's going to take a little bit of time, but there are methods of doing that. If you do have a serious mental disability that's going to cause you to be unable to take the test, unable to take the oath, that would include being in a coma, having Alzheimer's, serious dementia, things of that nature. It is still possible to naturalize. There is a process. You're definitely going to want to find an attorney to help you out with that, but it is possible to do it, and it might be something worthwhile to look into. They have naturalized people that are in comas. They've naturalized people that really aren't able to effectively take the oath of allegiance. It's in the Immigration Nationality Act that they are supposed to take reasonable efforts to reach out to people in that way. And again, like I mentioned, you can get fee waivers for all of this. So it is possible to do it, and it is possible to do it for free. You really do need to find an attorney to help you, but you should definitely consider those options if you have someone who's in green card status and needs to become a permanent citizen, U.S. citizen so they can qualify for benefits. You do want to look into seeing if that's going to be possible with waivers and accommodations. So with that, I think I actually finished. I was planning on finishing. Anybody have questions, or should I turn it over to our resource panel? No questions? Yeah.
In one document, it is convinced, okay, and it applies for citizenship. Can he still be deported when he's applied for the citizenship?
You're asking if an undocumented person applies for citizenship? Okay, so let's back up just a little bit.
Maybe I missed something.
Yeah. So in order to apply for citizenship and naturalization, you do need to be a permanent resident first. It is absolutely, and that's the only way. That's the only way. Well, okay, let me back up. Down here in the green, if you're in the military, then there's a shortcut. But there's no magic route from being undocumented to applying for citizenship. Despite what you might read in the editorial papers on a somewhat weekly basis, there's no method for people that are undocumented to just apply. You do have to be a permanent resident first. In order to be a permanent resident, you have to have one of those things I mentioned before. You have to have either a family-based petition or an employment-based petition or some kind of other petition based on being the victim of a crime or persecution of something of that nature. So there's a lot of times this ladder that we started out with up here, way back at the top. People may go through all of these different statuses at different times in their life. You may be someone with no status at all. and then get into a non-immigrant status, and then ultimately become a permanent resident, and then ultimately naturalize. Okay, but you do have to sort of go in that order, and there's no shortcut to citizenship without going through naturalization, absent joining the military. Other questions? Your question, if while you're applying, if you could be deported, oh yeah. People are deported while applying for citizenship all the time. That's how I get quite a few of my clients. They wind up in deportation proceedings because they applied to naturalize, and in the process something is discovered. What? Why does it take 5 years after you get your residency? Well, that's the law, that you have to be here for 5 years before you can apply to naturalize. It's rooted in wanting to make sure that people assimilate and learn the culture and have formed allegiances to the country and things of that nature. Which is why there's a shortcut if you're able to join the military, because I guess I figure if you join the military, then you've proven that allegiance to the United States. But other than that, there's no way around it. Yeah.
So if a person is deported and they have American children, the children get left behind here and the person is deported?
The question was, if an individual is deported and has U.S. citizen children, what happens to the children? That really varies tremendously. Sometimes the children are left behind, sometimes the parent chooses to leave them behind. About 100,000 children every year, the parental rights are severed and they're put up for adoption against the wishes of the parents. In some cases, the children go with them. There was an ICE directive that came out, I want to say about 2 weeks ago, specifically aimed at preventing the termination of parental rights in the cases of parents who wind up in deportation proceedings. But that's a fairly new thing, and the reason the directive came out is because it's such a serious problem. It's going to vary tremendously based on the area, based on who the other parent is, if both parents are deported, where the parents are. But there are some really unfortunate situations where parents lose their parental rights and are not able to take the children with them. No? Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, everyone. So thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative. I just wanted to add a couple of things to that. I was asked to speak specifically about U visas and VAWAs. So let's see. Okay, so again, I'm Robert. I'm an immigration attorney. I'm licensed in Wisconsin, so my practice is limited to immigration. So these are just some of the common terms that you'll see when we're talking about U visas and VAWAs. We speak in acronyms, so I apologize about that. So you saw a previous slide which spoke about U visas, and this is just a recap. It's very important to remember that it's aimed at victims of crimes, and it's usually a serious crime, and so you must have suffered substantial physical and or emotional abuse as a result of being a victim of that crime. And here's a list of the crimes that qualify, and they are enumerated in the immigration law. And it also encompasses state crimes that are similar to the ones that are listed in the federal code. And it also applies to attempts, conspiracies, and solicitations of conducting these crimes. And so for VAWA, it's very important to keep in mind that even though it's called the Violence Against Women Act, it applies equally to men. And as Adriane was saying, you could be the victim of extreme cruelty or battery, and you could have been the spouse, parent, or child of a USC or an LPR, generally speaking. And this is also very important. In some states, even before immigration makes a determination as to whether or not you are deemed to be VAWA, an approved VAWA, you could receive a prima facie determination which would allow you to receive some public benefits, but that's very state specific, and in Texas, it's my understanding that's not a possibility. And so this just clarifies that under VAWA. VAWA is very big, and it's not just limited to immigration law, but within the immigration benefits that it gives, it's for self-petitioners, meaning you're the victim, so you apply for the benefit yourself. Cancellation of removal, when you're in deportation proceedings, you could apply for cancellation or self-petition VAWA. And the removal of conditions of residency, that's very specific, but it's in the situation where a spouse petitions you, a USC spouse petitions you to be a green card holder. And so that, generally speaking, it's for somebody who applies for the benefit within 2 years of having been married to the USC spouse. So you have to prove to immigration essentially that it was based on a good faith marriage. And this is just a rundown of the 3 different benefits and the requirements that are associated in proving up your eligibility for the benefit. So having a qualifying relationship, you were a victim of battery or extreme cruelty, you resided with the abuser, you have to show that you have good moral character. And usually what that means is you have to obtain a letter from a local PD or something that shows that you have no criminal background or some type of issues. As Adriane explained, inadmissibilities and showing extreme hardship, meaning that you would suffer extreme hardship if you were to be removed from the United States. And sometimes you have to show that you've had continuous physical presence before applying for the benefit. And so we thought it would be a good idea to just come up with a hypothetical, just so that we can analyze the facts to see whether or not the person would be eligible for a U visa or a VAWA application. So, Maria, an elderly Mexican widow, enters the United States without permission with her caretaker to join her naturalized USC adult son, and look after her grandchildren. The son promises her American luxury and comfort, and lies he will petition for her to make her more eager. In the first few years, son turns the caretaker in 2 eyes to upset Maria, and harasses and strikes Maria daily. He would refuse to fill needed medications and controlled what she could eat or drink. She became bound to the house and suffered severe mental and emotional abuse. He admits never filing any papers on her behalf and uses her inability to speak English and her undocumented status to scare her from seeking help. After a particularly violent episode, he pushes her over some furniture and she falls, breaking her arm and hip and sustaining numerous bruises. So, what can Maria do to obtain relief? Is Maria eligible for a U visa? Is there a crime? Yes, assault, if Maria timely reports. Is she severely affected as a result of the crime? Yes. Maria has sustained serious physical injuries and likely severe emotional trauma. Is she helping law enforcement? If Maria fully cooperates, there shouldn't be a problem, assuming that the local PD is willing to sign certifications. There are agencies that just flat out refuse to sign certifications, which is a requirement for filing a U visa application. Unfortunately, there's nothing in the immigration law that says local PDs or prosecutors, you have to sign a certification for these individuals who have been helpful or cooperative in the investigation of the crime. So, assuming everything is met, she should be eligible to apply for a U visa. So how about a VAWA petition? Is there battery or extreme cruelty? Yes, Maria has likely experienced both. Is there a qualifying relationship? Yes, Maria is the parent of a USC son over 21. Is she related to the abuser? Did she reside with the abuser? Yes, Maria was forced to stay put. Does she have good moral character? It's likely showable if Maria has no criminal record and seeing that her motivation was to reunite and take care of her family. Any inadmissibilities? None that Maria could not waive, it seems like, based on the fact scenario. So she should be eligible for a VAWA. And something that Adriane mentioned that's very important here, whereas a U visa requires you to cooperate with law enforcement, a VAWA petition doesn't. And it's also very important to know that a VAWA petition in and of itself does not grant legal status. That would be the next step, the adjustment of status, which would give you the green card or lawful permanent residency status. And so here are further reading resources that you might find useful if you'd like to follow up on this information. The Catholic Legal Immigration Network, known as Clinic, has a lot of information that's available to people online. The Immigration Center for Women and Children, ASISTA, National Domestic Violence Hotline, and USCIS does have informative information about the various benefits available to victims of crime. And here locally, the Battered Women's Shelter, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, the St. Mary's Immigration Clinic, Catholic Charities, FAESAs, we're all nonprofits that provide assistance on these type of matters. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. I'm sorry, can you repeat that? That's a good question. I guess it would depend. I mean, we don't know based on the scenario, right? It's just a made-up scenario. But if she were to turn in her son, then potentially I would imagine that the kids would be taken away because they would be in a situation where CPS gets involved and doesn't want the kids to be around.
I think the question was whether or not someone who is undocumented can be given custody of children. Is that your question? Presumably so, if a judge decides that she's the person to appoint custody to. Texas doesn't require that an individual have legal status in order to have custody of children. So, in fact, I routinely see custody situations where both parties are undocumented or the person who gets custody is undocumented. That's not a requirement in Texas. I think it is a requirement in some other states, but not here. Other questions?
All right, thanks everybody.